Conservation International Singapore. A round of applause for all of them. Thank you. And we have Ms. Bethany Hines, the Managing Director, Strategy and Impact Conservation International USA, to come up on stage and take your seats, please. Thank you. So, thank you all. And now I would like to humbly request Mr. Jason Knopf to start this discussion. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, and thanks for your introduction. I know we've all just had lunch, and we might need a bit of a pick-me-up energy-wise, so this is going to be a very interactive session, so we'll come to you for questions as well, so we hope we can have a conversation rather than just you listening to us speak as well, so we really appreciate you joining our session. We've had a really privileged couple of days so far hearing from some of the world's leading economists, most accomplished diplomats and leaders from the corporate sector as well. And now it's our responsibility to think about what we're actually going to do with the perspective that we've been given over the last couple of days. And so we need to talk about action, and that's what this session is going to be about, picking up on the themes from Saurav's speech last night and the ambassador's instruction to not just think big, but to think fast as well, because we've heard about the urgency. So this session is going to be focused on urgency and action and the things that we can do together to rise to these big challenges that are in front of us. So to start that conversation, I'm going to start with Richard. Richard has just come from the G20 in Bali, right before India took the G20 presidency, and was part of a very big, important announcement that I think can inspire all of us working in this region to think about how we can embrace India's G20 presidency next year for the benefit of the Eastern Himalayas. So Richard, will you explain a little bit about what just happened in Bali and what Conservation International has been working on with the government of Indonesia?
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here again. And we've got the unfortunate time slot of being right after lunch, so we'll try to keep everyone awake. And thanks for coming in to listen to this. At the G20 in Indonesia, there were three big announcements that the government of Indonesia made. One of them was, I think it was $20 billion for retiring coal plants on the accelerated time frame. Huge thing. The other one was an agreement between Indonesia, Brazil, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The three big tropical forest owners, managers, the places where they have jurisdiction over most of the tropical forests in the world. They announced that they were working together to conserve these forests. And the third announcement that we had the privilege of being part of with Indonesia was this idea called Blue Halo, a new way to manage fisheries. Now in Indonesia, the fishery is key to their to everything, to their economy, to their food security. I think something like 70% of the protein in Indonesia is caught in Indonesian waters and literally feeds the population, feeds the people of Indonesia, the fourth largest country in the world. But it's also very, very a very stressed fishery. It's amazing with how it's been managed and how hard it's been fished that these fisheries haven't collapsed. So it really was a critical thing for the people of Indonesia to really think about how they will manage this fishery in a sustainable way. But it's a hard thing to do. I think almost every fishery on Earth has collapsed in one way or another. Fish are so overexploited worldwide. But we can change this paradigm. And I'll start with a video about this exciting program that Indonesia launched. So maybe we could cue up the video. We need the sound.
Everyone agrees, in the face of the twin climate and biodiversity crises,
which is
the
why
need for conservation has never been more important. But conservation can be expensive, which is why conservation that pays for itself is often more effective over time. Introducing Indonesia's Blue Halo S, the world's first ocean conservation project designed to pay for itself. The Blue Halo S model is as simple as it is brilliant. Blue. An area of ocean is protected. Inside this marine protected area, fish nurseries thrive. Carbon-drenched mangroves flourish. Halo. Over time, the marine protected area becomes surrounded by a blue halo of ocean health, improving fisheries, economy, and carbon sequestration. S for sustainability. Revenue from the surrounding blue halo funds the ongoing marine protection and sustainable production needs. Things like patrol boats, catch-saving refrigerators, and other tools that support marine management and sustain economic benefits. Blue Halo S. It isn't just conservation, it's a business model, a marine startup that uses a blended finance approach that lowers the risk of investing the catalytic funding needed to achieve sustainability.
Indonesia is fully committed to leading on climate change through sustainable conservation and integrated ecosystem protection and fish production. We made a commitment in Paris and we intend to keep it. Blue Halo S cooperation will benefit to Indonesia as it integrates of bioecological economy, social market, science, and database policy.
We are now taking the next step in innovative ecosystem financing. Blue Halo S program will reinvest economic return back into ocean protection, also local communities, and this strategy can be used as one of the funding cooperation mechanisms.
This model is not just for Indonesia. Sustainable, scalable, science-based, climate resilient. It's a model that can blanket the world oceans.
Indonesia-inspired, Indonesian-led, world-changing. Blue Halo S, the world's first self-sustaining ocean conservation project.
Export it. So it's a very simple thing, closing the loop, linking production that's generating return and economic return with the protection that's providing the services that underlie that return. So that's really the first thing that the first real innovation that Indonesia, was really pioneering. But part of that is, okay, you do that. It's a simple concept. You do protection and manage better, your fisheries are going to grow, but then that should pay for itself, but you need the cash up front. So the other thing we came up with was financial instruments that allow that to happen. So we worked with the Green Climate Fund to develop a bond that the government of Indonesia or an accredited entity would issue. And we're still working specifically on this concept now. It likely will be a sovereign bond. But the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, has a non-grant part of their institution that can do credit enhancement. So because the whole thing really helps the GCF meet their climate goals, especially around adaptation for vulnerable communities, that doing this credit enhancement would allow GCF to meet their goals, but it would provide liquidity or provide cash flow and make the bond that Indonesia issued into a much more investable product. So it would go from whatever Indonesia sovereign bond when they would issue it, whatever that would be rated, to being very highly rated, AA or AAA rated. So suddenly it becomes investable by blue chip investments, whether they're other sovereign funds or banks or whatever. So that was a key part of it, was that we weren't just thinking of the protection side. We're thinking of what would it need to do the economic development, how much cash we would need to do it. And it's the concept is real money. We're trying this in one of Indonesia's fisheries management zones. That's about 1 million square kilometers. It's a big area. It's a huge area, 100 million hectares. And the bond, we're still working on the valuation, but it'll be somewhere in the range of 200 to 400 million. So that's a key part of it. And the de-risking element is really important, because that enables the capital markets to come in and invest and help and really help where it's needed. So I think the final real lesson from this was there was urgency in it. Indonesia wanted to make a fisheries announcement at the G20 as a host. And so usually if you all are familiar with what it takes to do a GCF grant of any sort, it's very slow. CI is an accredited GCF agency, and we've had other projects in their pipeline, and just the concept note will often take years. I think they average 3 or 4 years. But this one we conceptualized about a year ago today with government, and the concept note and everything, moved through the process in months rather than years. So I think it's a great example of really thinking about not just how you value nature, but specifically how you develop financial instruments with governments with urgency in mind in order to pay for it.
Hello? Oh, there we go. Thank you. The thing we want to underline from that is this urgency point. And what we've been hearing today, we need to move faster, as the ambassador was reminding us. And because of the G20 opportunity in Indonesia's presidency, something that would have taken 3, 4, 5 years happened in less than 1. And with the G20 presidency coming to South Asia now and is here from the 1st of December in India, what can that teach us? And that's what I think Saurav is trying to do with what he said last night. So we want to think about what are the big things we can achieve, not least because India has said that it wants to put nature at the heart of the G20 agenda. So it's a real opportunity. There's a lot we can learn from the Indonesian example. But in order to do that, we need to know what are the things that are going to have the biggest impact on these urgent challenges. And that's what Bethany is going to tell us a little bit about. So Conservation International, working with the Potsdam Institute, has produced a report about what we really need to do on the nature side of the equation during this decade to seize the opportunities ahead of us around climate change and biodiversity loss. So Bethany, do you want to talk about the exponential roadmap?
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So I was speaking with a colleague the other day, and at the start of the pandemic, he bought a small device. So this device was an atmospheric monitor. measures different types of things in the atmosphere, including carbon dioxide. And he originally bought it as a safety precaution. We were starting to reconvene in person in small conference rooms, and one would imagine and rationally assume that if you have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in a small room, that maybe there's not great air circulation in there, and perhaps we should spread out a little bit more your increased risk for COVID. But it also had another kind of knock-on effect, which was that, as he shares, at the beginning of the pandemic, the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, just on average, as he was looking at this monitor, was about 410 to 413 on average. And now, as he shares, he cannot get it to be below 417. So we have this urgency that we are explaining kind of in this very ethereal way. But it's happening all around us. It's happening right now, and there are real numbers and metrics around how we can, start to track these things and understand, where our targets might need to be. But it's happening to us. So the latest science tells us that we need to increase our ambition. And we need to, as Richard was sharing earlier in the earlier session, we need to transition from a carbon emitter to a carbon sink in a really quick amount of time. So by 2030, we need to be net zero. By 2040, we need to be removing 5 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere. And by 2050, that number needs to increase to 12. This is really helpful. We've seen the power of clear targets in different forums, international forums, in policy at the national level, and it's helpful to have a science-based and science-backed target for what we need to achieve in the next couple of years. We have to, this change needs to be on an exponential scale. It's both in how we consume and how we conserve. And we need an action plan to be able to do that. And this is what Jason was sharing around an exponential roadmap for the future. And we do have some bright spots that, in the energy sector that is moving along towards, some positive results. But we are, not going to get there tomorrow, right? Even if we take all of the cars off the road, we will still not be able to keep within our 2 degree and 1.5 degree targets. We have to consider the role that nature plays. So nature plays 30% of the solution to climate change. I think that this point is being better understood by governments, by communities, many of whom have known this all along, and by business as well. So we need this transition, and we need nature, but how are we going to actually go about solving this problem? What actions do we need to take, and where? And it comes down really to 3 simple things. We need to protect, we need to manage, and we need to restore. So forgive me if I'm looking at my notes here, because I'm going to share with you some statistics, some metrics, because again, I think that being clear, not just talking about the need for urgency in the very kind of ethereal way, but actually getting to some specifics is important. So protecting ecosystems, those stores of irrecoverable carbon that we cannot lose and we cannot recover on any human relevant timescale. So think, the forests of the Amazon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Congo Basin, the forests and peatlands of Indonesia, and also the ecosystems that we're in now. It's places like this that if we lose Indonesia, if we lose places like this, we've really lost our war. So we must have emissions from ecosystem loss every 5 years for the next decade to protect 45 million hectares of forests and wetlands. And this will get us to 4 gigatons of mitigation annually by 2030. We need to manage lands, including working lands, for climate benefits. So we have to double the amount of climate smart management every year through 2026, reaching 2 billion hectares by 2030. How are we going to get there? Who is going to play those roles? How are we going to finance it? This is 20% of the world's working lands, and this will achieve about 8 gigatons of mitigation annually. And then finally, we need to restore. Restoring natural ecosystems is truly more vital than ever, and we need to remove and sequester about 5 gigatons of carbon annually by 2050. This is at least 350 million hectares of forests. So at the heart of this journey is transformation of many things, the bulk of which being food systems. And as we know, anything with a consumable, that means job creation. So we can think about, as the theme of this conference is bringing in the economics of all this, how are we actually making this transition, not just manageable, but in fact profitable. So this is an ambitious goal and a picture ahead of us. It will require, complete revisioning of our supply chains, climate smart agroforestry, farming and grazing. These are the types of things and actions that we need to take that are outlined in this roadmap, as Jason mentioned. It also requires new partners, which I am really happy that this conference is being convened, because I think it's just the right people to think through how do we actually action against these really important goals. With that, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think the point about, great, we accept urgency, now what do we do? And that's what this exponential roadmap report is about. Professor Johan Rockström has put it together, and I don't know if anyone has seen, he has a documentary I really recommend about tipping points, which is quite frightening, about all the different planetary systems that we're coming up along the edge of. And you kind of watch that and you feel like, oh God, it's really serious. What do I do? Well, this report is the answer. You can look up where you are in the world. You can look up South Asia and say, okay, if we care, these are the things we have to do this decade. This is how much agriculture and land reform is going to do for us. This is how much we're going to get from X, Y, different bits of protecting and restoring nature. It gets specific so we can start planning our work around what's actually going to make the biggest difference. So really recommend it to you. Sarv, you gave a speech last night about what you thought we could do in the rest of this decade. Do you want to talk about what you think the G20 opportunity, learning from Indonesia's example, can mean for the Eastern Himalayas work that you want to bring together after this conference?
Thanks, Jason, Richard, Bethany, all for being here, and thanks to the audience for being here after lunch, even though you might rather be asleep, maybe. I think a lot of interesting perspectives here from Indonesia, from science, and I think especially from the point of view of urgency. So if I may, Jason, I'm just going to talk about like a micro scale of the urgency that Bethany was talking about using data. And because you talked about parts per million and carbon, right? And in terms of what we need to be doing as a whole globally to fix things. What I did talk about yesterday, but I will reiterate a bit of that, is that how that manifests itself in the region is that, of course, because of global warming and also because of deforestation, we've worked with clusters of villages not larger than 200 hectares. And these clusters of villages are losing land up to 5 to 10 hectares every year. So in the next 20 years, there will be no village left. And if there is no village left, all of these people who live there, maybe a few thousand, 3,000 to 4,000, would have to move from there. And this is not just a story in Assam. It is an even graver story in Bangladesh. And this story acts out differently in the high alpine Himalayas. Climate change plays out differently. People are losing livelihoods in different ways. So for us living in this region, from the mountains to the mangroves, climate change is a lived reality, and it's beyond carbon, right? So of course we do talk about carbon, and many of us in this room have been trying to scramble and build carbon programs over the last 2 years, because we know that it's an important instrument to fund the kind of work that we have to do and to scale the kind of work that we have to do. But we also know that sort of talking and thinking about this global lens of carbon can help not just restore ecosystems, not just restore forests and biodiversity, but in fact create a new pathway for development of the region, right? because nature is so intricately linked with human life, and nature actually has been paying for human life and livelihoods in the region. Over 80% of all the people who live between the mountains and mangroves depend directly on nature for life and livelihoods. So, of course, have we seen severe nature degradation? Yes. Have we seen severe deforestation? Of course. Has the deforestation stopped? No. And will the deforestation stop? I think it'll get worse, because as livelihoods get worse and as livelihoods are affected because of climate change, the only easy resort to cash that rural people have is timber, wherever timber is left, right? So we only see things getting worse. And the scales at which we've been working in India, the scales at which many of our partners have been working in Nepal and in Bhutan and Bangladesh, I think it's all been great. It's all been fantastic. There's been a great bunch of ideas across the region. But have we been able to restore as many ecosystems in a year that get destroyed? No. Do we have net zero reforestation in a year for the region? We don't. Do we have net zero reforestation in Assam, which is home and headquarters? No. Right? So we still, in spite of all the great work happening in the region, we are still losing more forests and more biodiversity every year. So I think there's a few hooks here. I think that the time is right, because I think all of us have done work in the last decade. Many of us in this room, Dr. Khosla has been doing this fantastic work for the last many decades, right? And we know what the solutions are to prevent our rural people from leaving their homes. We know what the solutions are to bring nature back and to at least create livelihoods. Can we improve on these solutions? For sure. Can we make these solutions work better, faster, cheaper? For sure. Do we have the time for that? Maybe not. So what we need to be doing is to actually bring together all of the solutions that we've customized and implemented across the region, and create a collective mechanism to scale these solutions. Will we stop improving on these solutions as we scale? No. I'm sure that as we scale, we'll make them work better, faster, right? And I think that the hooks are various. I mean, we've been hosting this event in the Eastern Himalayas for the last 10 years now. And we've been talking about the region. And I think that there is more talk in the region now about the region. In the parallel room, there's in fact a session headed by the Chamber of Commerce about connectivity in the region, about human to human connectivity between the mountains and the mangroves, right? And as we build roads and as we explore other modes of connectivity, rivers and everything else, what becomes more important for us is to look at our ecosystems. Most of our ecosystems are shared. There's very, very few ecosystems in the region that exist only in one or the other country, including the Chundarbans are shared. We need mechanisms for joint cooperation. We need mechanisms to make
Hi, thank you guys. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. Yeah, I'm Sampath Senivaratna from Sri Lanka. Uh, two, two questions, one for Richard. Richard, you talk about the blue halo model of Indonesia. I have a few like kind of clarifications that I like to see. One is, in a broader sense, how scalable this sort of a model in the rest of the Indian Ocean. Like Saurav said, everything is connected, and in the South Asian or tropical Asian context, the one main binding force of the region is the Indian Ocean. And Indian Ocean, through Bay of Bengal, for example, or Bay of Bengal greater ecosystem, which binds. So whatever happening in Indonesia would directly, negatively, or positively would affect the rest of the Bay of Bengal system. That includes India, Sri Lanka, Maldives up to a certain extent, and then the Eastern Asian, the rim. So how scalable this in the rest of the system? For example, the scale that I'd like to know is there a time frame for a government or a big industry that wanted to have this model to go forward of recovering the system? Say, is there if had somebody done a model to show that this area, this much area of, say, ocean, or this much area of lagoons and corals, if you protect as breeding grounds, what would be the net increase in productivity of the second halo that you talk about? Had that done, because that would be the real, if it is a business model, that would be the real, the money, the returns that you could talk about, right? That's the first one. Now, shall I wait for you to answer that, Anku?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. The whole point of the Blue Halo S model is that it is scalable. It's not a project, it's a strategy. And I think the thing to understand about it is there's two parts. One is a grant mechanism. We're also have a concept note from the GCF for a grant to do all the things that organizations like ours love to do, like use science to site protected areas, build capacity to manage protected areas, to develop these monitoring and evaluation systems so that we know and can feed back data into that management. It's all the things that myself as a scientist, we learn about in school, but there's often doesn't get applied in the real world. So we have funding for that, but we've done that all over the world. It's conservation projects, that are often, just like Saurav was saying, that's not enough. But the key part of it is that grant mechanism is linked to financing. It's linked to the bond. Those two things are together. The bond, the uses of this 200, 300, 400 million are linked to the work that we'll do in the grant part of it. The uses of the bond. There's lots of bonds development. You look around here in Dhaka, there's a lot of development happening. A lot of it is funded by concessional financing, by development agencies, by commercial markets. But that doesn't necessarily, it often does not, unless you're very explicit and thoughtful about it and drive towards protecting nature. So the grant part of it really helps us design the investment part of it so the two things are together. And in the end, the funding is from the capital markets. So it creates this virtuous cycle where we know that if we manage fisheries well, there'll be more fish, the economy will grow, there'll be potential for more value creation, but we have to create mechanisms and infrastructure for value creation on shore. So that could happen anywhere where there's communities and fish and assets. It can help fisheries rebound. It can help well-managed fisheries develop other kinds of value creation. We think it can be as applicable in small island states like Palau or New Caledonia or Fiji, as it is for India, for Sri Lanka, or anywhere where these communities really, these coastal communities depend on fish. So that's a key part of what we're trying to do is scale. And the second part of that question, as a scientist, is equally interesting. It's like, how much, how many fish will these areas produce? Are we really going to get this idea of spillover? And that's all sort of controversial at the science level. And this is a chance to try that out. Historically, marine protected areas have been in areas that are beautiful and have coral reefs. You look at marine protected areas around the world, that's how they're sited. But can we optimize protection of oceans for fish production and other kinds of value creation for communities? So it's a real science question, but that will take years, decades to really sort out and refine that. But let's start now on that exact question.
I had a second question. Is that okay if I go ahead?
Of course, yeah.
All right. Saurabh, and I think for Bethany as well. When you engage in conservation work in Asia, I worked in Alaska a little bit, and compared to that and the northern British Columbia in Canada, and here, like 60% of humanity lives in this region in Asia. So to find large stretches of land dedicated for like conservation, putting into a cabinet and close it, and getting that, providing clean air, clean water, and clean soil is hard. So you are talking about a mosaic of people, nature, and then the in-between variations. So the plantations and the medium to low managed agriculture is what kind of buffers most of these protected areas or truly important ecosystems. It's surrounded by a meshwork of agriculture and plantations. So when projects like large, big players to engage, how that works in Asian context, because there are large plantation owners or large lands are being mostly owned by either few large plantations or many smallholders. So how you integrate that into models where big players can come into play?
No, I think that's a very interesting question, and it's a bit of a long answer, but I will try to give you the short one. So if you look at the eastern Himalayas again, mountains to mangroves, most lands could be classified as either lands owned by government, private people, or indigenous people across countries. A lot of the land that we work on is land owned by indigenous people. This is also usually owned by a community, and the community sort of hands over land to various households, right? So, and a household with 5 people will have 10 acres, and household with 10 people will have more. The way in which we implement our work across these lands, so it is impossible to find large patches of non-fragmented forest area. Impossible. It is impossible to try and find patches of nature without humans, also impossible, including in sort of 3,000 meters in Nepal or Arunachal. So what we have to end up doing is to bring people together to try and identify the areas of land that were forested, to try and identify areas of land that were never forested or never had any other ecosystem, and try and bring back these ecosystems as they exist. In fact, a session happening right after this in the other room will also be interesting for you. We're trying to use better remote sensing means to understand what this land contained, and therefore what we must bring back on this land. I think what is becoming very easy and very exciting for the world to do is this whole idea of agroforestry, right? So let's do agroforestry everywhere. Everybody's talking about agroforestry across the world. What we fear is that lands that were previously forested are being lost to new agroforestry farms. We can see that happening. So through the kind of work that we do, we try and figure out ecosystems and bring back ecosystems as they existed. you did bring about the aspect of plantation or the entire plantation economy, which has been huge sort of in Sylhet, in Meghalaya, in Assam, everywhere else. What we try and do there is to work with, if they're private plantation owners, then work with them or work with smallholders to try and convince them and create models for how we can convert these largely monoculture plantations to multi-cropped and agroforestry based plantations. We've seen that in most cases, this is something that is better for business as well as better for biodiversity, so it does work. But have we been able to convince large, very, very large plantation owners to do this? The answer is no. So you can't find large patches of land altogether, impossible. Like when you're building large scale carbon programs in this part of the world, it'll be, I think that the biggest contiguous patch that you'd find would maybe be 4,000 hectares.
I think this is what makes the opportunity, though, from the mountains to the mangroves in the Eastern Himalayas so important, that it isn't Alaska or Northern Canada, these places where there's huge swaths of wilderness or potential, places to rewild. We need to bring nature back where people live and make nature work for people, not just for climate or other goals. And so that's really what the opportunity is. Saurav said that we need to care about this region, not just because of its importance to the world, but 8% of the world's biodiversity, 1 in 8 people on Earth depend on it. 250 million people live here. It's a huge opportunity. And I think it seems to me that a lot of big organizations haven't wanted to engage or didn't really know how to engage because there are so many people here. And I think the answer is you don't really need to do anything other than help. And that's what we're trying to do with Saurav and with partners who have this vision. They know what works with the communities and they just now need the finance to scale. So that's what we're going to try to work on. I'd be really keen to talk to any of you about as well. Right, we have time for one final question. Tamsil? No, we'll do two. It's fine.
So the question that I have is, I don't come from the world of conservation, right? I come from the world of really like understanding all kinds of environmental issues. And what I've noticed that the big issue in a lot of conservation projects is that a lot of young people who can be potentially involved are not usually involved in various ways, right? And even if you look at an example of Eastern Himalayan project, right? A lot of people within India would not have heard about it. A lot of people within India and different aspects who come from different parts of various backgrounds would have never heard about it. And do you, I mean, all of you have worked in different ways. Do you foresee that as a challenge? Because collective action is one of the biggest things that will actually make sure these projects can happen. And second, how would you get more young people involved? Because Global South rules, right? Like this is our moment. How do we make sure that more and more young people are involved?
Saurav?
I think I'll start and then I'll pass on for your thoughts. So I think Tamsil completely agree that we have not been able to even popularize the region to the rest of South Asia, right? Do people living in New Delhi know about the Eastern Himalayas or what it means? No. Do people living in Dhaka know about it? No, right? So I think we fail there. I mean, and let's just talk about the aspects of nature, not even about the aspects of culture. And I think that somehow has been, that we can probably attribute it to our sort of very recent histories, right? So a lot of shared culture, but I think just how geopolitics has played out for the region is probably to be blamed. On the other side, young indigenous people who live in the region also do not know a lot about their own indigenous histories or knowledge, right? So the problem is not just about information spreading from one part to the other, but it's also about intergenerational information that is not being passed out. So I think it's a problem of just what kind of information people access now and what is available in these platforms that people access, which is why I think we need to have, I think most conservation people don't think about marketing. We'll be scared about having to spend more than 0.5% of our budgets on working with somebody like you, for example, and saying that, no, we can't afford it, and we'd rather plant 500 more trees, right? But I think that is something which has to change. I think that we have to think about how to make that work. We have to think about how to get the message across. Do we need all young people to work on this? No. Do we need all young people to know about it? Yes. Will that help? Yes. And I think that young people, if they know, can contribute to the cause in more ways than just working with this cause directly. Richard, over to you.
Well, in many ways, that's the question. How do we engage the next generation? You know, and I'm old. You know, I'm sort of the oldest up here on the stage, and you know, this is the challenge. But it's also this idea that change is possible. You know, this next generation. I have a 17-year-old daughter, and that generation, I feel like, is this beautiful mixture of cynicism on one hand, you know, and they're cynical about many things, you know, governments, you know, the world they're inheriting, COVID, everything else, and cynical with good reason. So maybe it's not even cynical, but there's also this idealism and hope in that generation. And you know, how many people in here think we're actually going to be under 1.5 degrees? You know, it seems like so. Yeah, exactly. So it's low, but also how many people thought that Cameroon and you know would be in the semifinals? Croatia would be in the semifinals of the World Cup. You got to play the game. You know, it's like there's still a chance. You know, there's still hope for it, and this is the decade that matters. But this next generation really is the ones that we need to activate now, and they're also. It's actually that generation is really the driving force and providing the political will to enable people like me to go in and try to do something.
Just to add on to that, so it's funny, I had also written angry and ambition as just two of the kind of key, key sentiments that I think this generation is feeling, right? But I think they respond to action. You know, we've seen so much anger come out of these international conferences, these global conferences, because of the lack of action, the lack of real progress. So I think that if we're going to actually get young people involved in a real and tangible way, it's not about, it really goes beyond, you know, either storytelling or, you know, different engagement tactics. It's about pointing to the things that have worked and offering real solutions and how they can then get engaged in developing that for the future.
And I'll just close by saying one thing about sort of that point on action. What Sarah talked about last night, planting 1 billion trees from the mountains to the mangroves in the right places for the benefit of communities, that alone will require 4 million people working directly in reforestation. So in terms of getting young people involved, 4 million have a chance to be part of this effort just in this region, just on the reforestation side before you get to anything else. So real tangible opportunities to participate. And then those 4 million people telling their stories to their families, to their communities. That's change on a huge scale and is connected directly to action, not just describing a problem or just feeling angry. It's actually about doing something and taking pride in what they're doing that will really make the difference. Thanks very much for coming to the session. We'll be around the next couple of days and very keen to talk. And we're very grateful to Wali Para and the university here for inviting us to speak. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all for sharing your comments, thoughts, and invaluable suggestions. We're going to move to our next panel discussion, but I hope our tech people are okay. Okay, so we're going to wait for some time and then we'll start with the next session.